Yeah.
What are we doing? I have some thoughts. You had some thoughts, I think, as well, about maybe it's, you know what I was going to do
Yeah.
before we started recording, and I didn't do it. It was to go back to one of our bonus episodes where I think you were in the process of working on this this paper you wrote that's not been published yet about
Democratic minimalism
about
in theory and practice.
That one, yeah. And I think you were in the throes of working it, and I'd started sort of pushing you about the role of ultimately of religious faith for the necessity of religious faith for even being able to talk about justice. And I mean, I've read your not yet published paper since then, and I'm still not convinced that you can really talk about a lot of these things without God, which I think you cleverly allied in your paper. But maybe that's something to talk about.
Let's do it. Come at me.
Come at you, huh? Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's not really a problem for you because ultimately you're a believer, so it's easy for you to talk about justice, right? Do you believe, or how do you approach secular justice, Shadi? I guess is the main question. And let's maybe start there because that's easier rather than talking about a paper that no one's read and no one will be able to read.
Hopefully, eventually,
someone will be able to read it. But I mean, I guess the question is for me is there's this thing among the wokes, right? And that it's all tied to claims to justice. And you were among the signatories of the
infamous Harper's
now
letter.
Infamous
fabled
storied
Aesop's fables.
Well, no, it's real. Not so much fabled. The storied Harper's letter. And I mean, the argument there was not against justice per se, but it was against the sort of ideology that underpins it. So your argument wasn't necessarily with claims to justice of the woke movement, right? But I guess to me, and I mean, this came up when I think it was in the bonus episode with Ross as well. I find that the easiest way to get at the heart of the woke ideology and the problems within it is to basically point out to the fact that they don't have a real theory of justice, I don't think. They just sort of invoke it all the time. Because it's this weird secularized religious thing, there's no problem in it for them because they're operating in sort of a religious sphere. But as a, non-believer myself, I always find that their claims to justice, it just doesn't really make sense to me. I don't know how you approach that part of the woke stuff. Are you just troubled by the liberalism, or is there something else that's hollow in it to you?
They don't really have the liberalism.
No, exactly. The illiberalism, let's say, or that sort of lack of attachment to a liberal worldview.
Well, a couple things. I mean, it's interesting that I have such a problem with the illiberalism of wokeness, considering that some people accuse me of having a soft spot for illiberalism in other contexts, let's say in the Middle East, when it comes to Islam and Islamist movements, when it comes to Catholic integralism, which we talked a little bit about with Sohrab Ahmari on a recent episode. So I'm not completely consistent when it comes to my dislike of illiberalism. There are some that I'm more tolerant of over others. I think, and we can maybe get to that, but I think that what I find troubling about the woke approach to justice is that it's unmoored from theology. It's unmoored from transcendence. It's a constantly moving target, and I don't think that you can have an absolute objective sense of justice if it's always moving and changing, depending on the whims of its proponents. And that's, I think, what makes the woke moment, the revolution, if you will, a little bit frightening, is that you don't know where you stand vis-a-vis this conception of justice. So do I believe in secular justice? I'd say no, I don't. I think that you can only conceive of justice ultimately with some resort to God or a higher power. I'm agnostic, if you will, on what form that higher power should take. You don't have to be Muslim, Christian, or whatever. There are different ways to get to that sense of justice, and we know historically that theists, atheists, agnostics have been able to achieve something similar to what I'm talking about. I mean, well, yes, I think you can do it even without a higher power, but even the conception of the higher power is a diverse one, and people can approach that in different ways. It does help, I would say, now that I'm sort of thinking out loud about it a little bit more. It does help to believe in a monotheistic God, I would say, because I think that in the story of monotheism over millennia, we do have a somewhat rooted sense of justice that develops over time, that is somewhat shared across the different faiths. So I think that probably helps. And without that, I think that you start to struggle a little bit. The other aspect of it is that justice doesn't have to be only in this world. It can also be delayed or postponed until the next life, or until after we die, if you don't believe in the next life. And I think that with a secular conception of justice, you lose that notion of postponement or delayed justice. So, and we've talked about that, I guess, on a couple episodes, this idea of postponement, which I think is absolutely vital. So I'd maybe start with those as some initial thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's vital. I mean, even in your sort of conception of democracy, right? I mean, it seems that like that idea of religious postponement, at least in your telling, would allow people to, basically fight another day and sort of keep this sort of stuff happening. But it's interesting, right? That's not the logic of any of this. I mean, it's interesting to me that you're approaching it that way, because that's not, again, it's not really instinctive to me how democracy works, and that it's actually rooted in that kind of sense of justice being postponed, and therefore being able to sort of peacefully fight these things over and over again. I mean, I said it also to you in the bonus episode, however many weeks ago. I think the other part that's sort of missing in your account is this question of what constitutes the political community and what is in and out. I do think that as I was thinking through your arguments, if you take democracy and just sort of expand it to the world, and you talk about some kind of human community and doing that, it breaks down at some point, right? So, I mean, we can get into that later, because that to me also is fascinating. But the question of sort of secular justice and what it means, I mean, is that really all that bugs you about the wokes? That they invoke this kind of Jeffersonian, loose talk that's based in the what's it called, in the Declaration?
I know. I like Jefferson. I mean, I like Jefferson and the Declaration.
Yeah.
That's not the issue. I think, if anything, the wokes, I don't think, uphold the Jeffersonian perspective. I mean, certainly they disavow, at least some of them disavow Jefferson himself as an individual, and for I guess obvious reasons. But so I don't know if. Yeah, it's definitely not. I don't think they're in line with the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah. But
are they? I mean, do you think they are in some way?
Well, I mean, I guess the thing that strikes me about it is that the woke movement, I find it extra unconvincing when it's happening outside of the context of America. I all too quickly see just sort of your standard kind of anti-Americanism when foreigners do it, which is, most exemplified by that kind of German glee at seeing America have, basically racial and racialized, not conflict, but tensions. And, I mean, I've said this before on the podcast. I feel that there's a certain kind of morbid fascination among post-war Germans about those aspects of America, because it morally relativizes to a certain extent. And I think that's psychologically helpful to many post-war Germans still dealing with war guilt, basically, But what strikes me about the woke thing is that it is grounded in a certain concept of America. I mean, all their claims are grounded in it. Now, right? It's the twist is that instead of, like, say, Martin Luther King invoking that America should live up to its ideals, they say the ideals themselves are null and void because slaveholders wrote them, right? But still underlying that is a kind of appeal to justice, which is, despite all their protestations, only conceivable. A secular justice is only conceivable within the context of America, within the context of the American promise. So, I mean, maybe that's why I kind of feel I'm not woke. I'm not a fan of what's going on, but I at some ways I feel like I'm maybe less discomfited by it than you, if that's fair.
Yeah, I think I've noticed that in some of our conversations, that you're more comfortable sort of accepting that it's there and not getting worked up. And that's actually something that I admire about you, Damir, and I wish I was more like you. And I have made a conscious effort, I should reassure listeners, to table wokeness myself. I'm trying not to write about it or comment on it for the most part, but obviously we're all weak, and we suffer from the sins of the flesh and the intellect. So in this regard, I wish I was better. And I've noticed myself in the last couple days getting outraged by certain things that I've been following. It just happens to be the case too that my Twitter feed tends to have a lot of anti-woke people. I think the algorithm probably prioritizes them because I also follow a lot of woke people, but they just don't seem to appear as much.
Really?
Yeah. Sad.
So what's been agitating you, like, in the last week on the woke stuff specifically? Like the fact that Hunter Biden's racism is not being covered? I saw that was a bugaboo on the right this week a little bit.
Okay, but I'll get to that before I forget, though. I think the way you phrased the tension in wokeness is really interesting, and it may be worth revisiting in the future, that in some ways they are dependent on the American idea, but also disavowing it simultaneously. And I think that tension is really at the heart of this project. That, I mean, ultimately, the way you described it, I would say that they are disavowing the foundational American idea. I think you're right that they wouldn't, what they're saying and doing wouldn't be possible in another country in the same way. So they are in this sense thoroughly American, but not thoroughly American in the sense of upholding the founding documents or being true to what I consider to be the foundational premise of the American idea.
Yeah. And how would you characterize that? Like, what is it that you feel like they are most aggressively abrading against?
They don't believe in the founding moment.
Yeah.
And I don't believe you can be, I don't believe there's a conception of Americanness without having some respect or admiration for the founding moment. If you try to change the founding moment, and here I'm speaking metaphorically, but in some cases it's even literal, that they want to change, some of them want to change the founding moment from 1776 to 1619. And I'm fine with bringing 1619 into the broader conversation to sort of broaden our understanding of America. But when you start to talk about changing the founding moment or changing dates or saying that 1776 or whatever year came after that in the 1780s, depending on what moment you're looking at, that has to be disavowed. That's where I think that that's contrary to what I always understood when I was growing up to be the American promise. I mean, if you look at Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, they always drew very explicitly and directly on the founding moment and moments, and and that's how they drew strength.
Yeah,
that's how they drew inspiration. That's how they built a broad-based movement in support of their ideas.
No, look, I think that the woke thing is in trouble because it's going to like basically run aground on that. I mean, I think ultimately it'll be
But
less
it's
successful.
not. I mean, how is? This is where
It's early times though, isn't it though, Shadi? It just started. I mean, this could take 5, 8, maybe even 10 years to sort of work itself
well,
out.
look, 10 years is a long time, and there'll be a major imprint
For sure.
on American politics and American institutions 10 years. And I'm not even particularly optimistic that it will burn itself out in 10 years. I think it will probably decline in scope and intensity, but I think it's going to be an important current in our politics, maybe in a more subdued form for a long time to come in certain elite institutions. I think it's going to be hard to, because these people, I would say they're very aggressive, they're very uncompromising, and they don't tolerate dissent.
Yeah.
And I just don't know how the other side is going to gain ground when they're facing that level of intolerance of dissent. So in like top academic institutions, in say the New York Times and elsewhere, I don't see a very persuasive story of how this is undone. I can see how it's tempered, and we can live with that, and I can live with that. I don't think we need to, as I've said before, I don't think we need to defeat wokeism entirely. Tempering it is fine, but tempering it still means that it's going to play an important role in our politics probably for the rest of our lives.
Let's just unpack one thing though. It was interesting, right? I mean, it's you were talking about doing violence to the founding moment, and that's one of the things that has struck me in the course of the last however many, I guess, year or change that this has really gotten a lot of traction, right? Is again this sort of obsession with narratives. All of this is about changing the narrative in so many ways. In so many ways, it's it's even taking place in some sort of strange postmodern. It's a postmodern fight about amending the narrative of America. And I'm not saying that having a founding mythology is what's it called, unimportant somehow. Obviously, it is important. I think I remember how many years ago was it now that I became an American citizen, and you're in the courtroom there. It's a remarkable ceremony. If you haven't gone with a friend who's becoming American, or even just, I think you can attend. You don't have to be invited. You should at some point. I think all Americans should do it. You're in a courtroom, and it really is a subsection of the world inside there. It's a strangely moving moment. Not even strangely moving. It's a moving moment because you see everyone's really excited to be there. There's a sense of American optimism. All these fresh immigrants, literally about to become Americans, they all are there because of that promise of America, right? But at the same time, what's striking about the woke thing, and maybe also why I'm maybe less perturbed by it, is that, I don't know, I guess I'm also the product of learning about America that has always, even before sort of political correctness and all this happened. I mean, it's not like I wasn't taught in school that the Native American populations were exterminated. I mean, once you start reading serious history later, you see the extent to how this happened and just how nasty it was. But I'm saying it's just like, basically from a personal standpoint, by the time the woke frenzy broke over the country, I can't say that I was particularly, I don't think I've learned anything from their quote unquote rewriting of history. Now, it's an attempt to, I guess, rebase these narratives into a mythology of penance rather than a mythology of pride. I do think that's not great for a country, if that were to take hold, as some kind of like permanent pessimism about America. And I guess that should be resisted. But overall, how do I put it? It's tempered. My understanding of America, even as someone who was deeply moved by becoming American, was that this country has a very sordid and very difficult past that it's constantly, coping with one way or the other.
Yeah.
What I see with this, is just an emanation of a certain kind of spasm of something, of another turn of the wheel of America coping with its, again, quite sordid past. What's striking about it, again, on this level of narrative, is, did you by any chance notice or even have a chance to read? I think it came out yesterday. George Packer's new essay in the Atlantic about.
I saw it. Haven't read it yet.
It's good. I recommend it warmly. He comes up with this typology of, four Americas, like four tribes. And, one is sort of like the libertarian Reaganite. One is the sort of meritocratic modern Democrat. One is the Trumpy sort of populist. And the fourth one is like Justice America, i.e. the sort of woke side. And he talks about that. What's striking about it is that the sort of meritocratic Democrats are now doing this pantomime of, oh, we didn't know, and thank you, wokes, for enlightening us to this. That's dishonest. Everyone who's a meritocrat, who's read a single book, knows that America has had a nasty history. You know what I mean? So, I don't know.
Yeah, this is a good point, because I think that it was self-evident to me growing up in, I guess, the public school system that I happen to be in Pennsylvania, that, Native American slavery, that was covered pretty explicitly, and I don't recall any effort to sort of get around it. And then in college, I was I read Chomsky's work and other critical theorists. I think I've mentioned before that I was the only guy in my feminist theory class.
Yeah, who among us?
Yeah. And my first academic article that was published in a journal was actually about feminist theory. And, Foucault and all that, I don't remember what it was like to read them in the moment, but I remember that was a big part of my intellectual upbringing. And totally. I thought it went without saying that we all knew that America had a sordid past. So the idea that any of this is new I agree with you, is bizarre to me. And maybe that's where I come at this from a little bit of a different angle. I remember, what was it? A People's History of the United States of America by Howard Zinn.
Yeah.
We all knew about that. We all read that, and we all thought it was important. It sold millions of copies. It's one of the best-selling history books in American history. This is just... Yeah, so, and even when it comes to foreign policy, I'm always very clear that I think we have a tragic past where we've done incredibly destructive things to other regions and nations, first in Latin America in the 60s and 70s onwards, and then more of what my concern is now with the Middle East, and that is ongoing to this very day. None of that really, for me, undermines the American story. And I think this is where I have trouble relating to the woke account of America, is I don't see how this sordid history, that these accumulating sins undo the American story. I think in some ways they're an important part of the American story, and that's what inspires me to commit myself to a certain set of ideals, because I believe that the U.S. can be better. I also do believe, though, that as empires go, we have, even with our last few sordid decades during the Cold War and to this day, we're a better empire than Belgium was. We're a better empire than England was. We're so on and so forth. Certainly the French. So when it comes to, not to sort of, Neil Ferguson, I think, makes an exaggerated version of this argument in his book Colossus, which I remember reading when I was in college. And it resonated with me partly, but obviously, you can go too far in saying that America is a good empire. No, there is no such thing as a good empire. There are empires that are better than others, because empires, by definition, commit atrocities. And I think that someone said this. I think it was Sam Hasselby, our friend on Twitter, and also an editor at
Eon, right?
Eon magazine, where he said behind every rich country is a great crime.
Yeah.
But then other people said behind every country is a great crime.
Right, but so look. I mean, that gets us to some interesting stuff, right? First you thought I was snarking when I agreed with you about Foucault and the rest of that stuff. I mean, I was tweeting that when Ross Douthat wrote his recent column about the temptations of Foucault and using that. That made me realize, in fact, quite how indebted I am to sort of that tradition of looking at this sort of stuff. What's interesting to me is that I outgrew all of that critical theory stuff, all that postmodernism stuff, but it's not like I outgrew it in a sense of rejecting it. I just found it not sufficient to be able to do anything with, I mean, ultimately. And that's, I guess, how I also see the sort of woke moment, because, they are very much tied to this sort of stuff. But maybe the part, this gets back to the question of justice, is that, in the sense that I guess, put it like this, I think that if you take the sort of, postmodernist approach to power relations and all of this, and you talk about these sorts of, deeply ingrained network effects of whatever, I don't like to use the word oppression, but just like power relations, whatever, how these things tend to perpetuate themselves and sort of exist over time. I generally think that there's something to that narrative, that line of criticism of any sort of social situation. I think Foucault does a pretty good job of describing how societies work. The hollowness of Foucault and, quite frankly, the woke movement is that, they point to this, and then their answer is what? I guess it's to, pick apart these power structures, but that's not, even Foucault realized that's not how this stuff sort of works. You don't like take apart power. Power exists and these relationships replicate themselves. So it's like, it's partly this like deconstructing nonsense, which is, I think, part of this, why the woke movement is so theatrical and so performative, right? Because it's all about, showing and dismantling these sorts of things. But again, with Foucault, I think that none of this is actually going to make a difference, because it's, power is ultimately the main thing that defines most of these sort of relations in societies. And power doesn't just, get defeated by penance or something like that, which seems to be what the sort of drive of the woke folk is. So, I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is that, like, what I've taken away from my undergraduate education as, a philosopher who was compelled to, but also was drawn to a lot of the sort of postmodernist stuff.
You were a philosopher in undergrad?
Yeah. Yeah. And now I'm just a bullshit artist, to quote Mel Brooks. It's what I'm getting at is that, like, it seems like so obviously a dead end to me. Like, that is to say, like, I think I share a lot of the sort of materialist critique of America, but I also understand that, like, that as a way of looking at the world, it is completely a dead end. Like, it just doesn't. The world doesn't work that way, and all appeals to justice. Maybe this is what I'm getting at. It's like my godless sort of lack of sense of what one grounds justice in, unless it's something transcendent, which I don't personally feel myself. This just seems like a dead end, and another reason not to get so worked up about it. I understand, like, maybe they're a little bit like whatchamacallit, Cultural Revolution Maoists or whatever, and it's a little scary, and it's certainly scary to people who've lost their jobs when in this sort of, like, indoctrination stuff, and there's crazy stories coming out all the time, and people are really scared not to cross these lines. None of that's good. But it just seems so self-evidently a dead end to me, because, like, philosophically it's a dead end. They have no answer. And as a mode of critique, it's correct, but who cares? Do you know what I mean?
Okay, but it's not self-evidently a dead end. Because if it was self-evident, then we wouldn't be here talking about it, right? I mean, what do you mean it's self-evident? It's obvious maybe to us, but I mean, history is replete with examples of intellectual and ideological dead ends that people continue pursuing. The fact that it's a dead end doesn't render it null and void.
How seriously do you think, though, how much traction do you think this stuff has? You know, again, the comparisons are with sort of basically communist ideology, cultural Marxism, et cetera, et cetera. How much traction do you think that has? Maybe this is a blind spot for me in the sense that, you know, being from that world, seeing it sort of collapse, and, you know, for that, and you're sure, like, I didn't live through the Cultural Revolution. I'm not Chinese, but you know what I mean? Like, the Cultural Revolution happened under Mao, after Mao had already established a certain kind of state. How, and the right is always up in arms about, you know, what the Cultural Revolution is doing to America. I'm just trying to sort of plumb why I'm so confident that it's not going to go anywhere.
But it's already gone somewhere. It's already happened, Damir. This is not a hypothetical construct. What do you mean? We see the results already.
The results are people losing their jobs, and you know, some of our most august institutions just becoming unreadable to normal people. I guess, I mean, I'm worried more about polarization and what this does to our politics over time, because it creates an irreconcilable thing.
Well, that's a big effect. So even just taking that by itself, but also there are other more tangible effects. Like, I think that the significant, even perhaps dramatic rise in crime that we're seeing can't be separated from the woke moment. That
I welcome that, though. Good Lord, I welcome that.
Wait, what do you mean? Welcome higher rates of crime?
Because this is the movement slitting its own throat. I mean,
go on. Okay, but that has a major impact on people, and like, people are suffering from that, and people are going to continue dying because of this. Maybe it does heighten the contradictions.
Yeah.
And it helps people realize that wokeness is dangerous, but that's a real tangible effect on the ground that we're seeing in local communities.
Yeah.
And
am I so callow to say, well, things happen in the world, i.e., you know, political movements have consequences, but I'm confident enough that you know, the self-evident stupidity of this is going to catch up to this movement?
Okay, but it'll catch up, and then what? I mean, if it's already having these bad effects, and it's already affecting mainstream institutions, and even the CIA is buying into this woke rhetoric and using it and instrumentalizing it, if it's affecting college admissions where Asian Americans are being disadvantaged because, despite what the woke people say about supporting AAPI or Asian American or whatever they say, I mean, it affects people's lives on a mass scale. It's hurting our cities. It's undermining our cities. The epidemic of homelessness that is worse than I've ever seen in my life, that we can see in pretty much every major city right now. These are profound effects. That have, it's not just about rhetoric. It's not just about New York Times articles. It's about policy ultimately, because these people are affecting policy.
Are you telling me that we could be in a better place if this hadn't happened? Agree.
No, I'm saying it's destructive, and it's not a hypothetical destructiveness. Now, you might say, well, that's life. Destructive things happen.
Correct.
But then okay, sure.
But correct. I mean, maybe this gets back to this whole sort of questions. I mean, maybe it's my inability to get worked up over bad outcomes of certain things. You know, I mean, maybe it's this sort of perverse.
But what's more bad than a bad outcome? I don't understand. Like, what is the worst case? So
Civil war is the worst case, I think. Like, if we get into that, then
okay. So you're just saying that wokeness is not going to lead to a civil war. Fine.
Right.
I don't think anything is going to lead to a civil war. I don't think a civil war is really possible in my lifetime in the U.S.
Well, that's good, right? I mean, that means that we're a healthy society.
Because I believe in American democracy. Ultimately, it's resilience. I mean, people can hold me to that if a civil war does happen and say, "Well, Shadi got me wrong. Shadi got it wrong," but I won't care, because then we'll be dealing with a civil war. I don't think anyone will care about like what I wrote or what I said like 30 years prior. But I am, yeah. I don't think a civil war is likely or even possible or plausible. Mm-hmm. But then what we're talking about then falls short of that. I mean, the worst case outcomes that are realistic are the ones that we're currently seeing or that we will see in the coming years. That's what I'm concerned about. That's what I'm worried about. That's going to affect people's lives in the interim until we find our senses. So why don't we? So that's, I mean, to say that, to kind of put that to the side and say, oh, well, you know, bad things happen. Sure. But I don't want bad things to happen.
Okay. I mean, but then all we're talking about is just like criticizing a silly movement that has no chance of actually achieving its stated goals.
It is achieving its stated goals as we speak.
What? Wait, its stated goals are helping oppressed communities. It's manifestly not doing that. In fact, by just the things that you cited, most of all being the crime wave, which is quite frankly, again, I don't mean to sound callous, but that is a delicious outcome. Like a delicious outcome.
Damir, no, I mean, come on.
No, come on yourself. What are we talking about here?
Okay, but look, as someone who lives in a city,
yeah, it's unpleasant.
It doesn't taste delicious to me.
I mean, I also, I've been in DC somewhat longer than you, and I remember a DC of the 1990s. We're fine. I'll say that as well. But you know what I mean though? Like, again, it's maybe it's my deep lack of sense of progress as well. It's like I remember DC as a truly dangerous place where metros closed at like 11 o'clock.
And I kind of remember that because I overlapped with that period a little bit. I don't want us to return to that period or to get close to that.
I mean, do you know what I mean? Like things happen, especially politics and things like that operate in cycles. We're not constantly improving anything. I mean, maybe this is, again, my sort of lack of progressive instinct on any of this, but I watched this happen. I mean, I think what the transformation of DC through the 2000s and up until recently has been, quite frankly, a miraculous thing. I would have never predicted it to happen. Now that it's reverting to a grubbier sort of pre-thing, sure, it's tragic. It's a shame. But it's also a product of something that is, I think, authentically American, this kind of weird secularized religious movement that is now baked in with this kind of, dead-end philosophical tick about critiquing and analyzing and deconstructing power relations that has no chance of working. And I don't know, it's called America, I guess, is what I look at this sort of stuff,
look, I'll take it.
Yeah.
Let me be more clear about where I take issue with your analysis. I mean, I think that is it wokeness's stated goal to help minorities? I guess it is, in a very generic, vague, unspecific way. But I think the more proximate goal of wokeness is to take over mainstream institutions and to undo power structures and reassemble power in this new kind of utopic vision that prioritizes people based on whatever the word, ascriptive, so based on identities that people are born with, basically, and not based on merit. Not based on merit or being good or being just in any kind of objective sense.
Yeah.
That's the goal of wokeness.
Yeah.
It may not be the most stated goal because it puts them in problematic territory if they're too explicit about that. So fine, I take that point. But in terms of what their short-term goals are and what their medium-term goals are, I don't think it's really about, I mean, they may think that they're helping minorities, but I don't think that's what the movement is. If we want to deconstruct the woke movement and look at what they actually are doing, I think it's about power. Yeah. So I think they are already achieving that. And
but maybe this is where my materialist side, I'll even go further materialist. I'll say my Marxist side comes out. That's not, you're not gonna change anything by taking over the New York Times. You know what I mean?
Damir, they've already changed things. And we've already talked about the proximate effects that we're seeing in real time. Again, it's not civil war, but those are things to be concerned and worried. Like, if we're not troubled by rising crime, where the net excess deaths in a particular city might be 2,000 more deaths, let's say. I'm just putting out a number. I recall seeing the 2,000. Maybe it's not in a specific city, but in a more kind of aggregate level in certain, I don't know, regions or whatever. These are things, that's 2,000 lives lost.
Yeah.
I mean, what could be more important than that? I mean, we rightfully, start national movements when one person of color is killed by police, and we should be outraged about that. But if we're not similarly outraged about the deaths of hundreds of people in a particular city or in a particular region, or I don't know what the number is on the national level, then what is there to be outraged about? I mean, the death of American citizens should be, if it's caused by proximate independent variables that we can assess, then we should be concerned about that.
I mean, again, like, I
don't understand. Like, what else is there to be like really concerned or troubled or outraged about?
Well, I mean, I just feel like it's, look, a couple of points though. First and foremost, the mechanism by which this deconstruction of power relations is working, as far as I can tell, I saw, is it Zaid or Ziad? I always get that backwards.
Zaid Jilani,
yeah. He wrote a piece recently on his Substack talking about the rising crime stuff, and he cited some report, basically seems to be restating the Ferguson effect as, an element of sort of woke dogma and whatnot. But the interesting thing about the Ferguson effect is,
it's
again,
the opposite of woke dogma, though. To be clear, the Ferguson effect is that crime gets worse and killings of minorities, populations.
Right.
More people of color die in the places where people were protesting against things like Ferguson. Isn't that the argument?
Well, the argument though is that the Ferguson effect argument is the now what they're calling the Minneapolis effect, is that police are doing less policing because of the implicit threat to their careers and whatnot by the sort of political climate that's arisen. How do I put this more clearly? Of course, every death of every American is to be deplored, but this is what politics is for. You address this, and now we have real incentives to address this, which undermines the very sort of essence of this sort of stuff. I mean, I guess what I'm opposed to is if you take this woke spasm as given, and you ascribe to it a certain kind of immaturity, which is, I think, what it is. It's an unlettered kind of emotional, quasi-religious, secular religious, not really religious, but you know what I mean, movement, a spasm of some sort. Well, yeah, like countries spaz out and people die. I'm not celebrating this. I am celebrating the fact that, like, we're getting perverse outcomes from what is itself perceived as a morally righteous sort of thing. That contradiction is wonderful. This is good. I want all of your friends and all of your people who are sympathetic to this to grapple with this. But
they're really not going. I don't think they are going to. They see higher levels of crime. I don't think they're going to grapple with it. I don't see really. First of all, I don't think a lot of lefty Americans or even Democrats who live in like nice areas, because most elite Democrats who are part of these mainstream institutions aren't the ones suffering from the crime wave. So there's also a kind of stratification here that's built in to our lack of awareness. I don't think it's covered. I don't think there's a lot of awareness that crime has gone up by 30% or even higher in certain cities across the country. So how can it be addressed if people aren't even aware of it?
I mean, a friend of mine from New York just visited. She was deeply aware of it. You and I are aware of it in D.C. now, right?
But we're not in the Democratic Party power structure, and the people who are in it don't like talking about crime, because talking about crime is basically perceived as being racist now, because you're paying attention to to people of color who are killed by other people of color, and we're generally supposed to only pay attention to people of color being killed by white people.
Shadi, don't you think that the remember that leaked DNC call right after the election when it wasn't yet clear that the 2 Georgia seats would go Democrats' way? The bitter, the impassioned anti-woke diatribes the Democrats were saying, like, we
in
were
private,
nearly
because
massacred.
they're afraid to say it out loud. They're afraid to say it to their own voters, to their own constituencies.
Look, again,
yes, I know some people talk about this in private, but that's not going to be enough. Look, the other thing I would say is that I'm also coming at this, I think, from a little bit of. So I actually, this is actually this is an important point I wanted to raise earlier, that I'm thinking more about. So I was listening to this podcast, this New York Times podcast called, I think it's like Nice White Parents. It's actually quite good about the attempts at integration in different New York schools and the role that white parents play with their privilege and all of that. It's good, but there's obviously, as you might expect, a woke bias where the podcast host and narrator is obsessed with whiteness. So it's even when the outcomes are good in a particular school, she's not able to basically appreciate that and say this is a good outcome. She says, well, the good outcome came about in part because of white parents or white administrators and their policies. So it's bad in of itself that the good outcomes came from bad people, i.e. white people. This is the kind, and I got really angry today. I was listening to it. It's episode 4, and we included a link to this particular episode because the first 3 were, I think, pretty interesting. I had some objections, whatever. Episode 4 is, I'm like, wow, this is what these people think.
Yeah.
It really is not about helping people of color live better, like have better standards of living. It's about, I don't even know how to describe it. Again, whenever I describe wokeness, I can't describe it accurately because when I start to, it sounds so absurd that I start to even doubt my own sanity. I'm like, they don't actually, no one actually believes this. It's like wokeness is a form of perpetual gaslighting.
Yeah.
That's really what it is. It makes you doubt your sanity.
Yeah.
That's why it's hard to combat. The other thing I would say is that what bothered me, what I would say even terrified me, I don't have kids, but if I did have kids, and as someone who wants to have kids in the future, I think about, young children going through a school system where this kind of ideological indoctrination is par for the course, and it frightens me. I don't want my hypothetical kids listening to this stuff or being I don't even know what, corrupted by these ideas that prioritize skin color over everything else. I don't want them to grow up with that, and that's really scary. That we're going to be contending in these major cities that are run by the Democratic Party, which is my preferred party, but they're actually promoting ideas that I worry would corrupt my hypothetical kids. That, I think, drives it home a little bit more. This is not some sort of like intellectual playground where we debate ideas. These are the communities that we live in.
Well, I mean, I think maybe the part that's here's the other part. It's sort of, this sounds like it mirrors, our debate about the fate of the New York Times. I don't mind that the New York Times becomes unreadable. You regret this. I don't mind that the Democratic Party gets colonized by a bunch of wackos because I just feel it's defeatable. Just like the New York Times becoming silly, I think opens up an opportunity to, actually operate.
But what if it's not defeatable, and what if it changes the way we raise our kids in our communities? We live in these communities. We live in these cities.
Here's the thing. My parents moved to a place in order so I could have an education. I don't think that's a crazy thing to do. And I'm not actually, the beauty of America is the ability to sort of move. I mean, you're right. Even as a completely secular person, if I had a kid right now, I'd probably figure out a way to not send them to public school, certainly not to a Democratic controlled with all the teacher unions and stuff. I'd be very careful about this stuff.
But can you afford that?
Well,
Can you like? So a lot of people won't be. I don't even. I mean, I don't
maybe
know
I'd
how
move to
much
a red
these school-
state. Maybe I'd move to a red state. Quite
Okay,
frankly.
but what?
And
Okay, but what if I want to
stuff.
stay in DC because this is my home and this is where I've lived for a long time and I'm attached to my sense of being somewhere as opposed to anywhere, and I don't want to leave my city to just so I can like find a non-private school where my kids won't be indoctrinated. I mean, these are huge things. I mean, we're talking about tens of $1,000s a year to put your kids in a private school.
Yeah.
I mean, so I mean, again, like what that matters. If that doesn't matter, what does?
Well, I don't know. I mean, honestly, I used to sort of mock the whole sort of homeschooling movement, but I'm understanding it a lot better now. Not that that's also any sort of easy solution to this sort of stuff. I mean, part of it, I think, has to be that, and this is a real weakness for liberals who don't want to instill a kind of, red pill in their kids. But I think the other the important thing to do at this point is to basically, you have to counter-indoctrinate your kids when they come home, tell them their teachers are lying to them about X, Y, and Z, and really be quite vigilant about this sort of stuff. Yeah, look, it's not ideal. It's not great. And again, maybe you're attached to DC. I've been talking, for a while now, and especially with the ability to, be able to, work from anywhere more and more. I don't know. I question my attachment to DC more and more.
Okay, where else? Okay, I want to raise my kids in a city or close to a city that's almost certainly going to be a liberal area that Democrats control. I can't imagine an obvious candidate for going to, and honestly, I don't want my kids to be raised under a red state education either, where God knows what they're going to get there and people be racist. I mean, I'm still, presumably if I had kids, they'd still be people of color in some sense.
To a certain extent.
Yeah, to some extent at the very least. And, I don't want them to grow up like with a bunch, like the alternative isn't very appealing either.
I don't know.
I want my own side to be sensible. I want to fight within my own party, the Democratic Party, and I want to fight this madness.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you, I guess. I just, maybe it's because I have no attachment to the Democratic Party. And, I mean, watching, not that I have much of an attachment to the Republican Party either, watching them sort of self-immolate and now watching a sort of version, a funhouse mirror version of this happen on the other side. I don't know. Seems like lots of opportunities here is, I guess what I'm coming at here. Now, look, the indoctrination of children in schools, that's a big deal. And I don't know if I had kids how I would approach it. I would certainly ensure that I had a very hands-on approach to my kids' education right now, because I do think, again, from what sort of bubbles up in all of these, Barry Weiss reported things about, what's going on in some of these schools. Yeah, it's absolute madness. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's my faith that this all somehow self-corrects, because just in general, people are, only pushable so far on this sort of patent nonsense. Just patent nonsense.
I mean, are they?
Yeah, maybe not.
That's a big assumption. I don't have, I'm surprised that you have more faith in people in this regard than I do, as someone who doesn't generally have a lot of faith in human beings.
I don't have faith in human beings to, do the right thing. I do have again, maybe this is my materialism to it. It's just like, I feel that once, especially well-off people start getting hit where it hurts on this sort of stuff, that there'll be a revolt against it. I still maintain that this is the big hole in the whole sort of, idiot Foucauldian approach to this sort of stuff, is that power is not reformed by just, taking over superficially ideologically taking over these institutions and stuff like that. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we are headed to some sort of newfangled, cultural Marxism regnant over everything that just makes us shittier and weaker and undermines this country over time.
Well,
yeah, I don't know.
To return full circle, we started I'm kind of being flippant here, but also like partly serious. I mean, we did kind of try to start a revolt with the Harper's letter.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously that was really early days, and I'm glad that we did that and took part in that. Obviously, it failed and our side lost, and now we're, living.
To be clear, that's you and your signers. I wasn't signing any letter, but yeah.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
Just to
Sure.
be clear. Yeah.
Wait, you don't want? Okay, yeah.
No, I'm fine with the Harper's letter. Again, maybe this is my
Accuracy.
accuracy, and I just I don't know. I don't like activism. But anyway, go
But
on.
really, I just wanted to come back full circle because we do have to meet up with a couple of friends for dinner in about like 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So we do have to go.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot, and I think we will do a part two or a bonus episode where we can maybe untangle some of the more controversial aspects of this with a smaller group. We'll probably record that tomorrow. So I'll tell all you guys that if you do want to have access to that special bonus episode, and also the other things that we're producing at Wisdom of Crowds, including our weekly Friday essay where Damir and I alternate, you should subscribe and become a member, and you can do that by going to wisdomofcrowds.live/subscribe. You'll get a lot of goodies. So we would encourage you to consider that and to join our growing community. And we got a lot of exciting things in store, which we hope we'll talk about in the coming weeks, months. So thanks for joining us, guys. And I feel like you know what was interesting too? I think that I like that we ended on a note where Damir appears to be slightly more optimistic on a particular issue
Yeah.
than I am. That's very rare.
True.
So I would just say to all you dear listeners, savor the moment. Savor it while it lasts. We do not know upon whence it shall return.
Yeah. Yeah. Something like that. All right, Shadi. See you
Okay.
at dinner. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.